I had delayed the appointment for months, maybe longer. Life had a way of offering convenient excuses, and I'd taken every single one. Work was always too hectic, my schedule too unpredictable, the weather never quite right. But that morning, something shifted, some subtle ache beneath my ribs, some impulse I didn't recognize. I found myself dialing the number, confirming a time, marking it on the calendar like it wasn't anything unusual. Still, the moment I stepped into the clinic, I felt the back of my neck prickle. The waiting room was cold and impersonal, painted in a dull beige that reminded me of old hotel corridors and forgotten basements. A woman behind a glass partition mispronounced my name, and I gave her a tight-lipped smile. The magazines were outdated, the plants artificial, and the scent in the air wasn't floral or sterile. It was thick, almost sweet, like something meant to cover up something else. I sat rigidly in the chair, hands clasped over my purse, feet flat on the linoleum, willing the minutes to pass. Every second stretched like chewing gum left too long in the mouth. I didn't want to be there, but something heavier than obligation held me in place. When my name was called, I rose slowly, following a nurse down a hallway that seemed longer than it should have been. The lights flickered faintly, not enough to alarm, but just enough to unsettle. Doors lined the walls on either side, numbered, closed, silent. She stopped at the last one, furthest from the reception, and pushed it open. The room was small, windowless, dimly lit by a single overhead bulb. There was a metal sink, a rolling stool, a white cabinet with locked drawers, and a padded examination table draped in disposable paper. She gestured for me to enter, then closed the door behind us with a soft click. I stood for a moment, unsure where to go, what to touch. The air inside the room was heavy, warmer than the hallway, and smelled faintly of latex and something faintly sweet, like baby powder or perfume that had lingered too long on someone else's skin. The walls were bare, except for one laminated poster about breast self-exams. There were no clocks, no windows, no art. Just me, her, and a silence that didn't feel neutral. She introduced herself, though I barely registered the name. Her voice was calm, low, precise. She had short, dark hair and pale skin, with eyes the color of glass, clear but unreadable. Her movements were controlled, unhurried, as she checked the chart in her hands. She didn't ask many questions. Instead, she told me to undress from the waist up and handed me a thin paper gown, stepping behind a curtain to give me privacy. I changed slowly, folding my blouse neatly over the chair, hesitating before removing my bra. My skin prickled with goosebumps, but the room wasn't cold. When she returned, she didn't rush. She approached with a quiet authority, her hands in latex gloves, her expression unreadable. I lay back on the table, pulling the gown tight around my chest, though it barely covered anything. She adjusted the paper beneath me, her fingers brushing my arm in the process. It felt like a current moved through me, brief but unmistakable. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, just the awkwardness of being examined in such a vulnerable state. Her touch was clinical at first, methodical. She began with my throat, checking lymph nodes, then moved to my shoulders, collarbone, and upper chest. Her fingertips were firm, but not rough, the pressure consistent. But there was something about the way her hand lingered, just a fraction longer than necessary. The way her eyes remained fixed, not just on the task, but on my reactions. I kept my gaze on the ceiling, counting the tiles, focusing on my breathing. Still, I felt her watching me, not as a patient, but as something else. As she continued, her hands moved lower, fingers tracing the edge of my ribs before sliding gently over the curve of my breast. I tensed. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. Her motions remained steady, careful, but her thumb brushed across my skin in a way that felt deliberate. I could feel the heat rising in my neck, a blush blooming across my chest. My mind was screaming at me to stay still, to stay logical, to stay professional, but my body was beginning to drift, to react in ways I hadn't expected. She said nothing. The silence between us swelled. Her other hand pressed lightly on my sternum as she palpated the tissue, her touch slow, rhythmic. The paper gown rustled beneath me as I shifted slightly, caught off guard by the thrum of sensation that had begun to pulse low in my abdomen. I didn't want this to happen, didn't plan for it, but I didn't stop it either. I felt suspended, like I was no longer just in a room, but in some strange pocket of time where the rules had changed. Her fingers swept lower again, brushing along the underside of my breast, and my breath caught. I was sure she noticed. She paused briefly, then continued, now circling upward in a motion that felt less like examination and more like exploration. My back arched slightly without meaning to. I hated that she could see the effect she was having, but at the same time, I didn't want her to stop. My skin felt hypersensitive, every nerve exposed, every breath loud in the stillness. When she finally stepped back, peeling the gloves from her hands with that familiar snap, I felt cold, not because the room had changed, but because she had. The space between us had reopened. She looked at me briefly, her expression unreadable once more, then turned to make a note in her chart. I sat up slowly, wrapping the gown tighter around my body, though it was pointless. The air on my skin now felt foreign, like something had been peeled away. She told me the exam was over. I nodded, unable to meet her eyes. My hands trembled slightly as I dressed, every movement deliberate, mechanical. When I left the room, the hallway looked exactly the same, but I didn't feel like the same woman who had walked into that windowless box 15 minutes earlier. Something had shifted, something I couldn't explain. And as I stepped out into the parking lot, the sun felt too bright, the world too loud, and my body, my traitorous, burning, awakened body, felt like it had learned a secret it wasn't supposed to know. I couldn't stop thinking about her. In the days that followed, her face would surface in my mind at odd moments. While I stirred coffee, while folding towels, while lying in bed with the television murmuring in the background. It wasn't just her face, though. It was her hands, the way her fingers had moved across my skin, unhurried, with a precision that bordered on intimacy. There was something behind her touch, something deeper than routine, and I couldn't decide if I had imagined it or if she had meant it all along. My body hadn't been the same since the visit. That was the lie I told myself first, that it was physical, a lingering tightness in the lower belly, a subtle pressure that made itself known in quiet moments, like a low hum beneath the noise of everyday life. I told myself I needed to be sure, that maybe I had missed something, that perhaps she had. It was an excuse, and I knew it, but it gave me permission to call the clinic again, to ask for a follow-up, to request her specifically, though I wrapped the words in just enough false concern to make it sound reasonable. When the appointment was confirmed, a strange calm settled over me. It was like I'd stepped onto a track already in motion, something preordained. I prepared for it more carefully this time, took a longer shower, chose different underwear, not because anyone would see it, but because I would know. My skin was already aware of her before I even stepped through the doors. I moved through the clinic like a ghost from the past, retracing my own steps, hands colder than usual, mouth dry. She didn't seem surprised to see me. If anything, she looked as if she had been expecting it. The moment our eyes met, something in me tightened. It wasn't attraction in the traditional sense. It was tension, memory, a kind of aching curiosity that had been fermenting in my bones since the first time I left her presence. She led me down the same hallway, opened the same door, motioned to the same table. Everything about it felt ritualistic, and yet different, heavier. I described vague symptoms with careful words: strange tingling, discomfort with no source, a sensation that came and went, unpredictable but insistent. She listened without interruption, nodded occasionally, her face neutral but her gaze sharp. I watched her more than I should have, mapping the shape of her mouth, the slope of her jaw, the way her hands flexed before she put on the gloves. I told myself it was harmless, but my heartbeat said otherwise. This time, the examination began slower. She adjusted the table with practiced ease, and I climbed onto it with less hesitation than before. The gown rustled as I positioned myself, and for a second, I thought I saw the corner of her lip twitch. Her fingers returned to my skin, retracing the same paths, but the familiarity made it feel different. My nerves were already awake, responsive. Each point of contact sparked awareness. I breathed deeply to steady myself, but the rhythm of my breath betrayed me. There was something intentional in the way she lingered, how her palms spread across my abdomen, fingers splaying wider than necessary. I felt myself reacting, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. Like I was watching myself from the outside, a woman too old to blush, behaving like someone caught in a dream. I tried to focus on the clinical aspects, but the edges kept blurring. Her hand brushed against the curve of my waist, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stay silent. She didn't speak much, only brief confirmations, movements choreographed like muscle memory, and still each touch grew heavier with meaning. When she leaned in to examine the side of my torso, her breath skimmed across my skin, and I shivered. Not from the cold, not from fear, but from the electric realization that I had begun to want this examination for reasons that had nothing to do with health. I had created a fiction and now was living inside it. Afterward, I left the room shaken, more confused than relieved. The symptoms I had invented still pulsed faintly, but now they felt real. They had taken root in my body, twisted into desire and dread. I sat in my car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked the same, but everything underneath had shifted. I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Not about the reason I went back, not about the way I hoped she'd touched me more than she had, not about the ache that had moved from my belly to somewhere deeper. At home, the silence felt too sharp. I walked barefoot across cold floors, poured a glass of wine I didn't want, turned on lights I didn't need. I thought about her hands, her voice, the way she had looked at me, not with affection, but with focus, like I was a puzzle she was trying to solve, or perhaps a door she was trying to unlock. And maybe I had already let her in without knowing it. That night, I lay in bed with the sheets pushed down to my hips, staring at the ceiling fans spinning lazily above me. My skin felt hypersensitive, like it had been marked. I ran my own fingers across my stomach, mimicking the motions I remembered, slower, softer, but it wasn't the same. I didn't want my own touch. I wanted hers, and the shame of that thought curled around my spine like smoke. I dreamt of her that night, not explicitly, but enough to wake up breathless, tangled in damp sheets, heart pounding with a rhythm that didn't belong to rest. I reached for a pillow, held it tightly, eyes wide in the dark. Something was happening to me, something I couldn't categorize, couldn't dismiss, couldn't medicate. It was becoming a part of me, quiet and relentless. In the morning, I stood in the mirror and searched my own eyes for answers. I didn't find any. just a face that looked more alive than it had in years and more haunted. The third appointment was a decision I didn't question. I made the call as if compelled by something outside myself, as if my body had bypassed logic and handed control over to something more primal. I didn't fabricate symptoms this time. I simply asked if she had availability. The woman on the phone didn't ask for details, just confirmed the time and date, and I hung up with trembling fingers. It was no longer about pretending to seek care. It was about returning to the only place where my skin had felt fully awake. I prepared with a ritualistic precision. The shower was hotter than usual, steam curling around my limbs like a veil. I shaved places no one had seen in months. I moisturized slowly, deliberately. Every stroke of my hands a silent acknowledgement of what I hoped might happen. The underwear I chose was soft, barely there, more suggestion than coverage. I didn't want to be obvious, but I wanted to be ready. Walking into the clinic felt like stepping into a parallel version of my life, one where I could detach from everything outside those beige walls. The fluorescent lights still flickered, the hallway still smelled faintly of antiseptic and artificial citrus, but now it all seemed like set dressing for a scene already written. When she appeared at the doorway, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning for me, something inside me stilled. She looked the same, composed, unreadable, precise, but her gaze lingered half a second longer. It was enough to confirm what I needed to believe. The same room, the same door, the same whisper click of the latch sliding into place. I sat on the edge of the table, waiting for instruction, my thighs pressing together beneath my skirt. The silence felt thicker than usual, intimate and loaded, as if every molecule in the air had gathered to witness whatever was about to unfold. She stood for a moment by the counter, glancing down at the chart, though I was certain she wasn't reading it. There was nothing new there, nothing that needed her attention more than I did. She moved toward me, and the soft hush of her shoes on the linoleum sounded louder than my heartbeat. When she asked me to undress, her tone didn't change, but there was something different in the way she turned her back, not out of modesty, but as if giving me space to make the choice myself. I slipped out of my clothes methodically, folding them with care, as if the way I treated the fabric could shape the outcome of what would follow. The gown was cool against my skin, but my chest burned with anticipation. She returned with gloves, but didn't put them on. Instead, she approached me slowly, and with a gentleness I didn't expect, lifted the edge of the gown to expose my torso. The paper crinkled beneath me as I leaned back, the sound embarrassingly loud in the quiet room. Her hand settled on my stomach, bare, warm, ungloved, and I froze. There was no pretense anymore, no performance of medical necessity, just skin on skin. Her fingers moved deliberately, drawing slow lines along the curve of my ribs, brushing the underside of my breast, skimming my waist. I felt myself melt beneath her touch, body softening like wax and heat. My breath caught, shallow and inconsistent, and I watched her face for signs of hesitation, but there were none. Her expression was calm, focused, but something flickered in her eyes, intent maybe, or hunger barely restrained. She lifted the gown higher, exposing more of me, and her hands followed, mapping my body with a reverence that felt both sacred and profane. Every place she touched awakened something deeper, something that pulsed just below the surface. Her palms flattened against my hips, her thumbs brushing over the bones there as if they were tuning forks. I arched slightly, involuntarily, offering more of myself without words, and she accepted the invitation in silence. The scent in the room had shifted. Gone was the sterile tang of disinfectant. In its place rose something warmer, saltier, skin, breath, arousal. It clung to the air like incense, faint but undeniable. I could feel my own body responding, heat gathering low in my belly, spreading outward like ink in water. My thighs ached with tension, my nipples hardened under the thin gown, and still her hands roamed with that same quiet authority. When she leaned in closer, I felt her breath ghost across my chest. Her fingers brushed the inside of my arm, trailing up to my shoulder, then down again with exquisite care. I closed my eyes and surrendered to the rhythm of her movements, the way she never rushed, never faltered. Every touch felt choreographed, not by practice, but by instinct. She knew where I would be most sensitive before I did. She pressed lightly on my abdomen, her other hand sliding beneath the gown to cup the soft underside of my breast. My breath hitched again, louder this time, and she didn't pull away. Her thumb brushed across my nipple through the fabric, slow and deliberate, and I felt a moan rise in my throat that I barely managed to swallow. My hips shifted on the table, desperate for friction, for contact, for her. Her hand trailed downward, fingers tracing the line of my pelvis, stopping just short of the place where my need burned hottest. I whimpered, quiet but undeniable. She hovered there, not touching but not retreating either, her palm warm against my skin, her breath steady. I opened my eyes and looked at her, and for the first time, she looked back without restraint. There was no confusion in her gaze, only confirmation. This was happening. We both wanted it. And then she stepped back, slowly, gracefully, her hands leaving my body as if she had never touched me. The absence of her was a wound, sharp and immediate. She moved toward the sink, washed her hands in silence, and only then did she speak again, softly, like nothing unusual had occurred. I sat up slowly, still trembling, the gown crumpled around my waist, my skin flushed and alive. I dressed in silence, my limbs heavy, the scent of her still clinging to my chest, my thighs, my fingers. When I left the room, the hallway seemed unreal, a flat corridor that no longer belonged to the same dimension I had just exited. The receptionist smiled blandly as she scheduled my next visit. I nodded, barely hearing her words. My mind was still in that room, wrapped in the memory of her fingers, the rustle of paper, the scent of sweat and skin. In the car, I sat motionless, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart thudding like I'd run a marathon. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just breathed, in and out, trying to hold on to the ghost of her touch before it slipped away. I had entered that room to feel something. I left with far more than I could name. She became a fixation I couldn't reason my way out of. Her touch, her silence, her eyes, they stayed with me like a scent clinging to skin. Days passed, but they didn't feel like days. They felt like the space between breaths, stretched and fragile. I would replay the moments on that table as if they were scenes from a film only I could access. Each time I closed my eyes, her hands found new ways to explore me, ways that hadn't yet happened but lived inside the potential of memory. I stopped pretending I needed a reason to see her. I stopped inventing symptoms. I started showing up, not at the clinic, but elsewhere. I learned the rhythm of her life, where she shopped, where she parked, how she carried herself outside the walls where I first knew her. It wasn't stalking, not in the way that word is typically used. It was reverence. I needed to understand if the intensity I felt belonged only to that space, or if it followed her too. The first time I saw her outside of work, she was exiting a grocery store, carrying a single paper bag, no cart, no rush. She wore jeans and a soft gray shirt, sleeves pushed up to her elbows, sunglasses hiding her eyes. But I knew it was her by the way she moved, measured, fluid, like she was never in a hurry, but always certain. My body responded instantly, like a muscle memory. A low heat unfurled in my stomach, shameful in its familiarity, yet welcome. She didn't see me that time. I didn't want her to, not yet. I wasn't ready for that part. I needed to hold the vision of her untouched by my presence, untainted by interaction. I watched her drive away, memorized her license plate, the slow blink of her turn signal, the way her wrist moved on the steering wheel. That night, I sat in bed and imagined her arriving at her home, unlocking the door, turning on the lights, and stepping out of her clothes. I imagined her bare feet on cold tile, the stretch of her arms as she reached for a glass, the quiet solitude of her life. Weeks bled together. I wasn't living anymore. I was orbiting. My world narrowed to the sound of her voice in my head, the texture of her gloves, the invisible map of where she touched me. I began to touch myself differently, not for release, but for remembrance. I would close my eyes and follow the same trail she had traced: sternum, side, hip, breast. But no matter how carefully I moved, it wasn't the same. I wasn't her. My fingers could never carry the weight of her permission. Eventually, I reached out. I left a note at the front desk. It wasn't signed. It simply said, "Do you ever think about that room?" I knew she would know what I meant. There was no reply. Not for days. Not until a small envelope appeared in my mailbox, unmarked. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address and a time. No words, no name, but it might well have been a scream. I arrived early, parked a block away, hands shaking as I checked my reflection in the mirror. I had worn something simple: soft fabric, loose neckline, no bra. I wanted her to see me as accessible, pliable, open. When I knocked on the door, I didn't know what would happen. I only knew that if she didn't open it, I might fall apart. But she did. The hallway behind her was dim. She stepped aside without speaking, and I walked in like I had done it 100 times before. Her apartment was minimal. Clean surfaces, muted colors, no personal photos. It smelled faintly of eucalyptus and something faintly sweet, something I couldn't place but wanted to inhale forever. She didn't touch me right away. She watched me move through the space, observed how I looked at her books, her kitchen, the art on her wall, anatomical sketches framed like relics. My skin tingled, anticipating a touch that hadn't yet arrived. Eventually, she gestured to the couch. I sat, and she disappeared into another room, returning with a folded sheet in her hands. Without a word, she draped it over the couch and motioned for me to lie back. I did. There was no performance, no question, just movement, obedient and deliberate. I watched her slip off her jacket, roll her sleeves, and tie back her hair. Everything she did had the quiet gravity of preparation, not seduction. It made me tremble. When she finally placed her hands on me, it felt like returning to something ancient. Her palms were warmer than I remembered. She didn't start with my breasts or thighs. She began at my ankles. Her fingers circled the bone, pressed along tendons, glided up the line of my calf. I lay perfectly still, trying not to cry. Every touch was purposeful, like she was reading me, remapping my body inch by inch, reclaiming it in silence. She moved slowly, methodically, past my knees, across my hips, up the curve of my side. She avoided the places most people rush toward. Her focus was elsewhere, on the hollow between my ribs, the base of my neck, the dip of my shoulder. It was as if she was reminding me that my body was not a collection of erogenous zones, but a living archive of sensation. I wasn't a body to be used. I was a landscape to be read. When her hands finally reached my chest, she paused, not for hesitation, but for reverence. She placed her palm flat over my sternum, feeling the beat of my heart, anchoring me to the moment. Then, slowly, she traced her fingertips over the soft swell of my breast, not seeking response, but offering attention. My breath stuttered, my spine curved. She didn't push further, she simply stayed. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Her hands exploring, my body yielding. No words, no climax, just this endless unfolding. A study, a ritual, a communion. She was learning me as if I were a language she already knew how to speak, but wanted to hear aloud, again and again. And I let her. I let her translate me into sensation. When it ended, she covered me with the sheet, not to hide me, but to hold me. I stayed there long after her hands had left my skin, feeling the ghost of her fingers on every inch of me. I was undone, not in the way I expected, not from lust, not from release, but from the unbearable intimacy of being seen completely and touched with nothing but knowing. I began to lose track of the boundary between want and need. Her presence had seeped into me, filling the cracks in my thoughts, threading itself through my routines. I would catch myself standing in front of the refrigerator, door open, staring into cold air without knowing what I was looking for. I was hungry, but not for food. I'd begun to crave something more abstract, something tactile, wordless, embedded in skin. She had touched something beneath the surface, and now it pulsed with its own rhythm, one that refused to be silenced. The next time I saw her wasn't planned. I found myself outside her building with no real excuse, holding a paper bag with nothing but an apple inside. It was a flimsy pretext, something to put in my hand so I wouldn't feel entirely unmoored. When she opened the door, her expression didn't change, but I felt something shift between us. There was no smile, no question, just a pause long enough for me to feel my own heartbeat, then the quiet swing of the door as she let me in again. Inside, the space looked unchanged, but I felt its energy differently now. The room didn't just hold her anymore. It held the echoes of what we'd done, what we'd allowed. The couch seemed softer, the shadows deeper. Her silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like tension pulled taut, waiting to snap. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether I was trespassing or being welcomed back. She walked past me into the kitchen, barefoot and slow, as though the air wasn't thick with implication. I set the bag down and followed her without thinking. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me with those same unreadable eyes. My stomach twisted. The heat in me was no longer a gentle warmth. It had turned sharp, edged with desperation. I stepped closer. She didn't move away. That was all I needed. That one fraction of stillness was enough to break me. I reached out first. My fingers brushed her wrist, and I expected rejection, or at least a flinch, but she stayed. I touched her slowly, my hand sliding up her forearm, over the bend of her elbow, until it settled at the curve of her neck. Her pulse was steady. Mine wasn't. She watched me like a scientist observing a reaction she'd already predicted. And then, slowly, her hand rose to rest on my hip. That was the line. Up until now, she had been the one initiating, the one in control, the one pressing the edge without crossing it. But now she touched me in answer to my reach. Her fingers dug lightly into the fabric of my skirt. My body melted into hers as if it had been waiting for this alignment. There was no fanfare, no sudden kiss, just contact, pressure, breath. I leaned into her and felt her shift against me, our bodies aligning like puzzle pieces that had always known how to fit. Her hands moved under my shirt with deliberate care, sliding over my bare back, warm and firm. I pressed my lips against her collarbone, not kissing, just resting there, inhaling the scent that now lived inside my memory. She let out a slow breath, and I felt it against my cheek, a quiet surrender. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to explain. She took my hand and led me to the bedroom, and I followed with the calm of someone stepping into a decision they've already made. The room was dim, sheets still rumpled from a sleep I hadn't shared. I sat on the edge of her bed and looked up at her, silently asking, silently pleading. She responded by pulling her shirt over her head. She stood bare-chested in front of me, her skin pale in the light, her body strong and quiet. I touched her slowly, like committing her to memory with my hands. Every curve, every dip, every freckle. She allowed it, watched me, her breath shallow but steady. When I leaned forward and pressed my mouth to her sternum, she trembled slightly. That was the second line crossed. We undressed without haste, removing fabric like shedding identities. When I was finally naked, she stood in front of me, fully clothed from the waist down, her fingers brushing over my shoulder, down my arm, then back up again. Her touch was different now, less clinical, less structured. There was tenderness in it, but also possession. I lay back, the sheet cool beneath me, and waited. She joined me without ceremony. Her body pressed into mine, thigh to thigh, stomach to stomach, mouth to mouth. This time, the kiss came. It was slow, almost hesitant, lips brushing, then pressing, then opening. I moaned quietly into her mouth, the sound surprising me. Her hands gripped my waist, pulled me tighter, and I wrapped my arms around her like I was drowning. The sheet tangled around our legs, and I didn't care. Her mouth moved to my neck, my shoulder, the space just beneath my ear. Every inch she touched felt like a confession. My body opened for her, eager and pliant. Her hands slid between my legs, fingers teasing, circling, dipping. I gasped, not from surprise, but from relief. I was ready. I had been ready for so long, I had forgotten what it felt like to finally be touched where I ached most. She didn't rush. Her fingers moved slowly, finding rhythm, coaxing my body to meet hers in movement. I reached for her, touching her wherever I could, her back, her hips, the nape of her neck. Our bodies moved in a quiet choreography, skin on skin, breath on breath. When release came, it was quiet, deep, a trembling that began in my belly and spread outward like waves. I cried without sound, tears slipping sideways into the pillow. Afterward, we lay tangled, breathing in sync, her fingers still tracing invisible lines on my thigh. There were no words. There didn't need to be. Something had shifted irreversibly. The barrier we danced around had been obliterated, and now we were lying in the debris, naked, exposed, real. I wasn't sure what we had just become, but I knew what we weren't anymore. We weren't an idea. We weren't a possibility. We were an act, a choice, a collision. And I wasn't certain I'd survive the consequences, but I knew I would never go back. The morning after didn't feel like morning. It felt like aftermath. The room was filled with a quiet that was too dense to be called silence, like the walls themselves had absorbed our breath, our movements, our surrender. I lay still in her bed, the sheet tangled around my thigh, the pillow smelling of her shampoo and my own sweat. My body was sore in ways I hadn't expected, thighs aching, chest tender, jaw slightly tight from how hard I must have clenched it during the quietest moments of pleasure. Her presence lingered on me like residue, like something I couldn't wash away even if I wanted to. She was already awake, sitting in the chair by the window, one leg tucked beneath her, her robe barely closed. She didn't look at me, didn't move. The light that filtered through the blinds cast thin lines across her body, highlighting the curve of her collarbone, the delicate tension in her shoulders. I watched her in silence, unsure if I was witnessing regret or restraint. I tried to read her posture, to interpret the precise angle of her spine, the way her fingers moved idly across the rim of her mug. She looked composed, but she always did. That was part of the danger. When I finally sat up, the sheet fell to my lap, exposing the marks she'd left on my skin. Faint red lines on my hips, a bruise just below my breast, the ghost of her teeth on my shoulder. I touched each of them, as if verifying their reality, proof that it hadn't been a dream, proof that I had let her do all the things I swore I would never allow, not to a stranger, not to a woman like her. She turned to me then, and something in her gaze felt distant, not cold, just closed. I felt the wall go up before she even said a word. The air shifted. The clarity of the night before dulled like a blade left in water. I wrapped the sheet around myself, not because I was shy, but because I suddenly felt outside of the intimacy we'd shared, like I was no longer welcome in the space we had created together. I dressed slowly, watching her from the corner of my eye. She remained still, unmoved, unmoving. Her silence now had a different shape, less like invitation, more like dismissal. I searched for something to say, something to anchor us to what had happened, but my mouth remained dry. The truth was, I didn't know what to ask. I didn't know if I wanted answers. Some truths lose their weight when spoken aloud. Before I left, she stood and handed me the shirt I had worn the day before. Her fingers brushed mine, but there was no heat in them now. Just contact, clinical and final. I took the shirt and nodded. She didn't walk me to the door. I didn't look back as I stepped into the hallway. The air outside her apartment cool and sour with early morning. The door clicked shut behind me, and it sounded too much like a lock. The car ride home was a blur. Traffic moved like molasses, every red light a punishment. I kept one hand on the wheel and the other between my legs, not touching, just resting there, over the damp spot that still hadn't dried. My body remembered her too well. Every time I shifted, I felt her imprint, like fingerprints pressed into wet clay. I hated that I still ached for her, even as the image of her turned stiff and unreachable. At home, I undressed in the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. The woman looking back at me didn't look broken, but she didn't look whole either. Her eyes were glassy, lips swollen, thighs marked with memories that would fade long before the feelings did. I stepped into the shower and let the water run hot, too hot, hoping it would burn away the parts of me that still clung to her. But nothing washed off. Her scent was in my hair. Her breath was still on my neck, and under my fingernails, the faintest trace of her skin. I scrubbed until I turned pink, until the loofah felt like sandpaper, until my legs trembled from standing. Still, I didn't feel clean. I wrapped myself in a towel and sat on the edge of the tub, dripping and hollow. My phone buzzed once from the other room. I didn't move. I didn't want it to be her. I didn't want it not to be her. I just wanted silence, the kind that didn't hold so many questions. Later that night, I lay in my own bed, staring at the ceiling, my arms crossed over my chest like I was holding myself together. I ran my fingers along the inside of my thigh, not to touch, but to trace where she'd been. The ache wasn't physical anymore. It was memory now, spreading like ink into everything I tried to think about. I didn't know if she would call. I didn't know if I wanted her to. What remained was a body that had been claimed without permission and given without demand. A bed that felt too big, a truth too tangled to untie. And under my nails, just a whisper of her. Something soft, something warm, something I couldn't see but knew I would carry far longer than I should.